Among the proverbs left in Dan's wake that describes so much about him is this: in the end, we are all knotted into the same carpet.
In the spring of our senior year in college, we heard the story of Dan Terry, an American humanitarian aid worker who was killed in 2010, along with 9 other medical workers in a remote area of Afghanistan. The first reports that came to us were of violence from a troubled area of the world. But we began to learn more about Dan, his fierce love for Afghanistan, those around him, and the remarkable adventure of his life. And that started us on our own adventure.
He loved Afghanistan. He loved the people, he loved the landscape, he loved everything about it. And there was not a single day that he was there that he felt like he was sacrificing.
His cup runneth over. His cup runneth over every day of his life. And what it runneth over with doesn't matter to him. Okay? It isn't the fanciest nectar and tonic. It's just that Dan's cup's always running over of something.
The best way to honor him is to have a conversation. Is to have a conversation about who we are as people, what makes us tick, why does that matter, and what do you know about Afghanistan? Have you been there? Because you should come, and once you come, you'll fall in love too, and you'll want to stay. Every conversation ended with an invitation to come. Come, just come. Oh, we'll find something for you to do. You don't know what you're interested in? Oh, we'll find something to interest you. Just come and see.
The Afghans have a story that at creation, when God was finished fashioning the world, there was a pile of leftovers, of boulders and rocks and stones. And the Afghans say God took those leftovers and dumped them all in this one place, and that is the country that we call today Afghanistan, where these great mountain systems meet and join and swirl, and where you have unbelievable heights. And of course, the mountains have done a great deal to actually shape Afghan history. It is that place of sort of isolation and of rugged, hardy people who have stood off all sorts of invaders from outside and have guarded their independence with such great jealousy.
My dad took thousands of photographs, and if you look at those pictures, you can get a really good sense of what he loved. He was always stopping in his tracks to capture on film images that were of value to him.
He had to stop, to take a picture, get them all there, to look at their own pictures. He could see beauty and everything, and it's not. I would say that it was inner drive what he had from God. That is his road.
There are photographs of landscapes, beautiful places with interesting lighting and color. If you look at the pictures of Afghan children, they're all wearing incredibly colorful clothing, and he loved children. Every little kid he loved. He saw hope, he saw beauty, he saw innocence and joy in their faces. The people are the flowers in that country. The beauty is in the people. My dad understood that and captured that and wanted to share that.
Well, it's important to know that Dan's growing up years were largely set in North India. He was in the Himalayan mountains, in the foothills, at a place called Landauer, where there's a school that he attended. And in fact, he and I met, classmates at this school called Woodstock.
He was 2 years behind me, though, once school started. And so we really became close then in 1966.
And of course, a feature of this is that he grew up in the land of Gandhi, who in the 50s and 60s, when he was in that growing up period, had a great effect on Dan. He was also, of course, greatly influenced by his parents. His father, George, was a man of great conscience. Even as a Methodist mission worker, he had been, during World War II, a conscientious objector. And that was a fairly rare thing in his peer set. Even at that young age, Dan had a great capacity to draw others. There was this sparkle about Dan. There was something magnetic.
We actually met in Kabul, and first time we really viewed each other. He came out of the dinner with one of our Finnish colleagues, and we looked at who is this American guy, who is this guy, you know.
Franklin, West Virginia is where Dan spent time when he was in the States. One of his good childhood friends, Daniel Taylor, lives here now. And we're going to talk with him and hear stories to better get to know Dan. Not really sure what to expect, though.
One of the most wonderful things about him was how maddeningly incomplete he was in communications. He and I decided that we were going to go back out to India. The only fun way to go to India, as far as Dan Terry was concerned, was to go overland. So that meant airplaning it to Europe, but then driving from Europe to India. So I had this message in my mail slot, see you in Switzerland June 1st. That's all. So I go to Frankfurt and I buy an old Volkswagen bus for $400, and then I head to Switzerland. And thinking, where in the world, how do you find Dan Terry in Switzerland on June 1st? Well, there were 2 flights into Zurich and 1 flight into Geneva. So I said, the odds are he's going to be in Zurich. So I go to Zurich and I meet the 2 flights, but it's Dan Terry. And so I page by long distance telephone. And he tells me he's in Geneva. And so I drive from Zurich and pick him up. Well, at that point, I've done my part. I've got the car. And it's his part to pay the gas all the way to India. So I thought I was going to get a good deal out of this. Well, Dan's got a plan. And Dan's plan is that we're going to sell seats to hippies. Well, mind you, this is 1968. The world is a blossom with flower children. Hippies are going back and forth across the Middle East. And so wherever we see a hippie, Dan stops, rolls down the window, says, you want to ride? This is the price per kilometer, 2 cents per kilometer or whatever it was. Dan's sitting there figuring it out. Hey, I might get to India for free.
If you ever got in the car and drove around with Dan, you would see that he had this weakness for those side roads along the way. He didn't want to stay kind of on the main track if there was some option. So the story is told by an acquaintance of his that they were together in the vehicle, and they flashed by a new track that had apparently been created leading back into the mountains. Dan hadn't noticed it before, and he was curious. So he backed the vehicle up. Apparently the road wasn't finished yet, or there were other things about the road that didn't make it fit for use. But Dan walked over and just removed the barrier and got back in the car and set off down this track. The friend who was with him, who told me the story, said that he turned to Dan and said, do you think that barrier might be there for a reason? And then Dan said, well, you never know when a side road will come in handy. The two of them drove down the track that came eventually up to a saddle overlooking a large swatch of country. When they reached the top of the saddle and were gazing out over this mountainscape, Dan turned to his friend and said to him, the last outsider who stood here was Marco Polo. Being in country where others seldom went, that's where Dan loved to be.
I feel like in Western society we are time oriented. Dan wasn't like that. It's really stressful to like think about time and the work, and you have deadlines for this. Dan didn't really have deadlines. He solved the problem as it came to him, and he just kind of went with the flow of it.
Dan just went into life, I'm gonna be 100% here and not worry about other distractions because I'm talking to you and I wanna know about your life. I think that there's a lot that we can learn from that.
Well, the highways and crossroads of South Asia are marked by these ubiquitous tea shops that are everywhere across India and Pakistan, Bangladesh, and into Afghanistan. So Dan made it a habit of stopping in these tea shops everywhere along the way. Along the street, there will be the kind of neat and classy seating. But in the back of the tea shop, there are the ones who are hunched, telling stories of one kind or another. When Dan approached a tea shop, he walked right by the cheery roadside seating at the front. He went straight to the back of the shop because he believed that they were the ones who really knew the sorts of things that Dan wanted to learn about, that he wanted to hear about. The things that worry them, the things that make them upset, the things they believe most deeply about their communities. And when Dan would walk away from the tea shops, you know, he had found some kind of friendship, improbable friendship, with those others would prefer to avoid.
Tea shops seem to be kind of reoccurring theme in Dan's life from the stories that people told us.
Dan went out of his way to meet new people, to go outside of your comfort zone and talk to people. He got so much out of that.
It never occurred to me that I was living an extraordinary childhood. I lived for the first 10 years of my life in the house I was born in. My younger sister was born in that house too. We had the same neighbors. It never occurred to me that this was somehow a little strange. It wasn't until I was an adolescent that I started to think that maybe my parents were really nuts for dragging me through their life adventure. There were times that I was frustrated to be his kid, and I felt like he didn't give me the same attention that he gave the rest of the world. That's not fair to him completely, but you know, as a kid, sometimes you feel like you wish that dad would just come home and not have somebody else with him. One of the other things that he used to tell me all the time was be gracious. Be gracious, Anneli, be gracious. He worked at that and modeled it. And that he didn't have it every day. You know, he was human. When my older sister was in college, she took an anthropology class. And in that anthropology class, she learned the definition of a nomad. And she sent a letter home to my parents talking about how she had just found a way to talk about who she was and who we were. We were nomads, not really belonging anywhere, but at the same time having this uncanny ability to belong anywhere, to find something in that place and something in those people to connect with and make it your home. We used to joke that wherever we put our carpets down, that was home. You ask us, where do you live? Oh, it's wherever my carpets happen to be right now. When I was about 17 or 18, my dad became cool. I really fought against my parents up until about that point. But there was one quarter break, which was a mid-semester break, where my dad actually showed up at the beginning of the break rather than the end of the break. And so 3 or 4 in the afternoon, he said, let's go for a bike ride. So my younger sister and I got our bikes ready. We threw sleeping bags on the back of the bikes and took off just as the sun was setting and the full moon was rising. And we rode a couple hours into the night until we were tired of riding, and then we pulled over and pitched a tent in some farmer's field and camped out. The next morning, we woke up, the sun was rising, and my dad went out to sit on a rock just to watch the sunrise. I had my Walkman with me, and he asked me what I was listening to, and I sort of said, "Oh, you wouldn't like it. You wouldn't. It was Bob Dylan. I should have known better, but I didn't." He took my Walkman and he plugged the earbuds in, and he was sitting out there and he started singing along. And all of a sudden, in that moment, my dad became cool to me, and I thought, oh my gosh, maybe he's not so bad after all.
I think most people would say that Dan's finest hour in Afghanistan was during the Great Famine. It lasted 4 years and ended in 2001. Dan Terry was concerned about the Central Highlands. The Hazarajat, the Hazars being the ethnic minority that is discriminated against. They're Shias, okay? They're former slaves.
It is among the Hazaras today that Dan is most celebrated.
We all have heard the story about, Abraham and all going into Egypt with the famine, okay? The same level of biblical proportion famine had hit Afghanistan in 2000.
A drought took hold of that part of Afghanistan, and even those channels that brought water from the glaciers and the hillsides could not sustain their fields. And then after the drought, of course, came the famine. And worse than that came the winter. And it was in the winter when the life of the Hazaras was hanging in the balances, these hundreds of communities, that Dan realized what was happening, that he wanted for the Hazaras not to be refugees in their own country.
So Dan organized huge truck convoys of wheat out of Pakistan. And this is in dead of winter, okay, when people are literally isolated in villages, starving to death. Because he was so trusted, the UN had given him access to 100 trucks. And they would bring in these vast transports of wheat.
Walking through the snow to try to assure, where the track lay, hidden there beneath the snowdrifts. And these trucks then went back into areas where winter traffic never had gone before. The villagers turned out in great numbers with shovels to remove the snow so that the trucks could get through. It was this kind of experience, I suppose, that many disaster relief people dream about being a part of, that Dan brought wheat to a community that was walking a knife edge. And it is those Hazaras who recognize that Dan stepped in at a moment of desperate need in their lives. There are occasions when this kind of activity is required for those who live in such circumstances. But Dan went on in time to make a discovery about this as an alpha and omega to what you do. Because if going into communities like this, your primary framework and vision is to bring goodies and provide services to these communities, you have done nothing to actually empower them as people. In fact, the opposite is true, that the more you provide and serve, the more disempowered people become, the more they are persuaded that they cannot do anything for themselves, that they are dependent on others to make a way.
So when Westerners go there, there's sort of different approaches we can take. One is to modernize and try to make them like the West, and most Afghans really resist that form of development.
And Dan found this to be a demeaning and pernicious effect upon others.
Another approach to development is really, we call sort of sustainable development, locally oriented development, where local people design and carry out their own development projects.
We look at Afghanistan as a failed state, as a dysfunctional place, but it wasn't dysfunctional for him. He knew how to make the system work there.
So increasingly, he committed himself to saying what we must do is we must permit Afghan communities to realize that their destiny is actually in their hands, that they have the strength and the gifts to find that destiny and to make a way. And we must help them find that courage and support them in the exercise of their imagination and calling and strength.
The stories about Brother Dan can go on and on and on. And they're beautiful stories, they're hilarious stories. But the deeper question is, why is he in Afghanistan? Why is he in Afghanistan when it's endangering his family? Well, the first purpose is, I think, a religious statement on his part that he told me many times. I'm giving a witness. Okay, I'm not preaching. Very important to be the reaching out of love without putting the name Christian on it, because at that point it sounds like it's evangelism. There's a second reason, it seems to me, which is that who else is there? Okay? The other people that are there, especially at the end, okay, when Dan gets assassinated, the other people there are invaders. The other people who are there are the development business people who are making serious money. For every dollar that is spent to develop Afghanistan, 90 cents goes to the developers, not to the Afghan people. 10 cents goes. To Dan's mind, that was a moral sin. The other thing, which is for Dan, it's fun. You know, Afghanistan was a constant adrenaline high. It was not because of the war, but just because it's a spectacular geography. Look at the pictures he takes. He loves the geography. And it's fun because he's driving these amazing vehicles that he's rebuilt, that he could never get past a US inspection. All this stuff, he was essentially his giant toys and playthings in Afghanistan. And he loved the simple things, like these tires that I use as flower pots here in Afghanistan. They're used as buckets to carry water in, but they're made out of old tires. And the idea of recycling and reusing something was phenomenal. But don't just recycle and reuse something simple.
He had a bicycle whose name, he named it, called Precious. And it too was cobbled together, not because he couldn't get a new one, but because he found that different parts of bicycles are better than others.
He had decided that the best tires on the bicycle were Chinese tires, but the Chinese tube inside the tire was no good. So he, for some reason, had decided the best tubes were Russian tubes. But the Russian valve was no good, and so he got American valves that he put inside the Russian tube, which was inside the Chinese tire. And at that point, he had the right combination. Now, I may have mixed it up. Maybe he had an Italian valve inside an American tube, and maybe his mind would change 3 months later. But one thing's for sure, he would look at the tire, he would look at the tube, and he would look at the valve, and he would decide what the right combination was. And maybe it was the right combination this week, but there was a bad batch that came out of the factory, and he happened to know there was a bad batch, and so he would change it around. Okay, he had fun. He had fun. This was a fun project. To the rest of us, it was maddening. Dan, why can't you just buy a bicycle tire and a tube? No, it's more fun to make it and rebuild it.
One day, Dan was out with his bicycle, and he came to a road block. This was during the time of the Taliban. They stopped him to interrogate him about his papers and other things like that. And apparently, according to his account, there was a sort of spontaneous burst of fire from one of the rifles being held by the guards. And it penetrated the handlebars of his bicycle, and he took a bullet somewhere in his lower leg, sort of in the spray of bullets. This made him love the bicycle all the more, that it bore the marks, of history and experience, told the truth, about life in Afghanistan. And he's standing there while blood is oozing out, from his leg and onto the road around there, and he's in conversation with the guards, trying to say, well, it's okay, don't worry, I'm not going to turn you in or make trouble about this. They finally called an ambulance, and of course he was taken in the ambulance to the hospital to be checked out to see that his wound wasn't anything serious. But he then insisted also that the bicycle be put on the ambulance with him, which, though it was wounded, of course the hospital could do nothing about. He was capable of meeting most any circumstance, however chaotic, even violent. It was like he didn't lose his bearings about faith and loving others and what it meant to be alive.
Dan was a person that really valued friendships. A lot of the people that he worked with and friends talked about how he did service differently. His type of service was really being friends with people, finding out what they really need rather than just going in and giving out a lot of different goods.
There was a period of time in central Afghanistan and Kabul where there was such turbulence during the time of the warlords that Dan had to go and live with his family in Mazar-e Sharif in the far north. he learned that there was a certain village kind of out beyond the end of the road, a place called Bek, a settlement of Ismailis. They met with the village elders to find out, is there any way that we can partner with you in achieving your dreams? When the question came to the village leaders that way, it was met with silence. They didn't know how to answer the question. In fact, this village apparently was so depressed, so eroded in self-confidence and aspiration that they didn't know what to say when somebody asked them, what is it that you dream about for your community? What is it that you aspire to? But after a while, a young girl stood up and she said, we need a school. Now that's a remarkable thing when you consider that this is a traditional community. But here's a 12-year-old girl who stands up finally when, everyone else fails, to give an answer. They sat and planned together. The village elders climbed on board, and 2 schools were built in that village of Bek. One for the girls and one for the boys. Later, the Taliban took over in that part of Afghanistan, and contact with the village was lost. And it's likely that the school didn't actually function fully after the Taliban took over. But some years later, a member of that team went back to the village. He found that the school was still functioning. And in the girls' school, the teacher was that 12-year-old girl who had stood up that day, years before, to say, we need a school. She realized that the mantle had fallen to her. There are so many things about that story that tell a truth about the way Dan worked, whose great aspiration was to empower local communities, to help them find their voice, to say what it was they dreamed about, what they wanted, and then to help them achieve that. That was Dan's way. And this little girl in the community of Bek crystallizes this side of Dan so beautifully.
The Terry family is still there. They are in Afghanistan during the 10 years of the Soviet occupation. There's not many Westerners who are there. Then the Soviets get driven out, by all the mujahideen and the guerrilla warfare period. Dan Terry and Seija and the 3 girls have survived that whole period of time, going in and going in. Then comes the mujahideen period, the civil war of Afghanistan. One Afghan faction is fighting against another, and they're factions that are primarily based on ethnicity. Tajiks, Hazars, Pashtuns. They're all vying for control in this political vacuum. Then, in the middle of that civil war, the Taliban come in from Pakistan, religious fundamentalists, and they bring peace to the country. They're out in a place called Lal-Sar Jungle in the middle of the Afghan mountains. Now, this is remote. And they're working there, out in the Taliban high area. Then this most amazing thing happens.
On the eve of 9/11, Dan and Seija had been told that they should leave immediately.
The organization we worked got the letter, said exit everybody out. Talibans were coming from the Bamiyan to Lol.
Dan realized that because they lived in such a remote place that they had received the news late that they should evacuate. The other colleagues and co-workers of theirs had already left. They had crossed the border knowing that something terrible was in the offing, though not knowing exactly what.
And Dan's friend, who's the Taliban commander, comes to him and says, you know what? I've got some really important business. I'm going to go away on my important business and I'll be back. And when I come back, unfortunately, you're my brother, I'm going to have to arrest you. And by the way, all the roads out of the Larson jungle are closed. So Dan goes home and says, I got a problem. I've just got a problem and I've been given a gift. As I mentioned earlier, one thing you always have if you're Dan Terry is you got vehicles. And he now also put in some flotation chambers so it would float if it got into the water. He says, all the roads are closed, but the river isn't closed. So he takes a truck, one of his other vehicles, loads it up with some 55-gallon drums of fuel, but he's got enough fuel to get from the central Afghanistan to Pakistan. And he loads up his fuel truck, he loads up his other vehicle, and he says, Borobakai. Borobakai means go in peace. And they drive down through the river, in and off the bank, heading out of the Larson jungle. They come on out day 2 later.
So Dan knew the back roads. He knew all of that country so well. And he found himself driving the poppy fields. And then sometimes he would drop down into the dry riverbeds, making his way eastward toward the Pakistan border.
We don't go to Kabul, no clue, map don't tell anything how we're going to get there, just hopeless. So it took us 2 days, either day, because we left 8 o'clock at night, whole next day, 2 nights. We ended up somewhere, we entered one village backyard and there was the, the marijuana fields, and we saw the Taliban white flag car there and, we were scared to death and I think they were scared to death because they took their flag out. And then it's in a bush, the telling radio, we are in a Peshawar and we are quite soon in a border. And I don't know where we are, Tora Bora, we just no clue. People did not know more than about the few-hour drive what is next village. So we got about the hour before border closed, before our time closed. It was nasty, pressed there on the border and we just pulled the soldier on, walked through and hold the passport and give anybody.
Dan's living on the edge. He has been given an escape notice by the Taliban commander back home, get out of town. He's headed for the pass, and he gets out. Life is that way for Dan Terry.
What we're really trying to do is weave, in a sense, an Afghan carpet, and it's beautiful. So I think it's a really great analogy for what we're really trying to do.
I guess a lot of times you might think of relationships as being more orderly. When you think about a carpet or anything that's woven together, it's like all of these interconnecting strings. Just the idea of thinking about the ways in which we're all connected. All jumbled together and woven in the same thing.
I remember my last time with him. It was April, Fool's Day, okay? And he shows up at my house here on Spruce Knob, here in West Virginia. And it's a nice day when he shows up, but that afternoon, it starts to snow. Okay, you can imagine, it's totally unseasonal snow, shouldn't have happened, We get his vehicle stuck going up this little hill slope there, and there's snow all around. And we just get down under with little shovels, and we're digging out from underneath the snow. We make 6 inches, we make another 6 inches, hook up my chain, we pull it another 10 feet. 3 hours later, he's out at the roadhead. He's out of the snow. Give ourselves some hugs. We could have been 16-year-olds again, okay? And here we were 60, whatever, 4, whatever our ridiculous ages were at the time, playing in the snow, having fun with busted down vehicles. And, you know, in the course of trying to pull him out, the chain had snapped. It had come back, it had knocked out his headlight. Oh, look at my headlight. Well, don't worry about it, Dan, I got some duct tape here. You know, let's put that headlight back on. Okay, we got the headlight back on, okay? And it matches. That duct tape looks pretty good with that blue of your car. Yeah, it looks good to me. You know, life's fun. And his cup runneth over. His cup runneth over every day of his life.
So Dan Terry worked with a humanitarian group that was going on this mission called the International Assistance Mission, which is actually the longest term international humanitarian organization that works in Afghanistan. This trip was to go up to Badakhshan province in the north of the country, which was fairly safe and secure, and to help villages that were very rural where there's no roads in, so they had to ride horseback and hike over mountains to get to villages that had no health care.
There's a little piece of videotape which was taken actually during Dan's last journey in Afghanistan. A piece of videotape that gives a little insight into Dan's way with people. And the videotape shows Dan with some local Afghan men. It's raining, but they are out in the rain engaging in a game. It's a game of rock shot put. He's holding the video camera and he's videoing the scene, which is of course terribly shot because the camera is moving all over, and one by one these young Afghan men step up, you know, and they're trying to get the hang of heaving these rocks, and all are finding great sort of pleasure in this little pastime that they've created. This was the ground on which Dan forged so many of his relationships with the Afghans, and why they came to think of him as not only a neighbor, but actually as a family member, as kin.
The international military forces in Afghanistan are using a strategy of counterinsurgency, which uses humanitarian assistance and development as a way to gain the local trust of local Afghans, as well as information about Afghans. So they'll go into a village and build a school or set up a health clinic for all kinds of political and military purposes. That type of development is very different than the type of development that's done purely for the humanitarian reasons of trying to alleviate suffering and trying to address basic human needs. Dan is not part of the international military forces. He was a humanitarian trying to alleviate suffering, and so was the rest of the team. But they were targets because they represented Western forces in some ways, because they were Westerners, and because military forces were carrying out the same kinds of activity. Many of the insurgent groups feel like they're legitimate targets, a way of hurting Westerners and the Western forces that are in their country that they want to leave.
Dan did groundwork to check with local authorities whether it would be safe, whether it would be okay for this team of people to make this itinerary.
So I was living at the International Assistance Mission house as the team was preparing to leave on this mission. So I was with them the night before and sent them off the morning of. Originally I had planned to go with them for the first leg of the journey, and then I decided not to because of my own work schedule.
All of the feedback that came from those points were, no, we know you, we know the party who is traveling with you, we have no objection to this, and you are quite free to conduct this, this itinerary.
There was a lot of discussion about security before they left. And there always is a discussion among us who are working in Afghanistan, which risks are worth taking and which risks are not worth taking. And in the discussion about this trip, there had not been insurgent activity in that region, and we all thought it was safe for them to go. In hindsight, we can see it was not a good decision for so many foreigners to all be traveling together at the same time.
The larger world does have at least the bare outlines of what happened when Dan's life came to an end, along with the others there in the party that traveled with them in the summer of 2010. They were traveling through an isolated area called Nuristan, which is something like 150 miles north of Kabul, in a very remote area. In fact, the valley where they were going had to be traversed on foot. So they were all carrying their gear and going from place to place in an itinerary in this valley. Having finished their itinerary and now preparing to return to Kabul, they loaded up in their vehicles again and then crossed a river and were on the other side of the river when they stopped probably to check the gear and the vehicles to see that everything was okay. And it was at that point that from some great boulders at the edge of the valley, there emerged a party of gunmen. There was an attempt apparently at some conversation with the gunmen, but this was completely refused. There was no response, and then the shooting began. And 10 of the party in the end were killed, and one person survived, an Afghan driver, who later told the story of what had happened, how this had transpired. The place actually is striking. First of all, in its remoteness. That was what Dan loved. He loved to be out beyond the wire, outside the fence, you know, in those harsh and wild places.
The Taliban makes a distinction between humanitarians like Dan and the group and contractors, military contractors who are trying to get information and win the hearts and minds of local communities for a political or a security objective. The insurgent group that killed this group of 10 humanitarians did not make that distinction. They were probably not from Afghanistan. There's not a whole lot of information about them, but the major insurgent groups separated themselves and denied that they were involved in killing these 10 humanitarians.
I think Dan, from day one of arriving there, knew that his life was rooted in this place. And actually, one of his very good friends said this about Dan, that it was a mercy that he was able to live out that lifespan in the place that he truly loved and to which he was completely devoted. Dan and his good friend Tom Little The two of them are laid to rest in Kabul, as both of them wished. Both of them had been in Afghanistan for better than 30 years, and they also knew each other well and had partnered often. It's in the old part of Kabul. There is a high wall, and outside, of course, is the din of the market and the activity of people coming and going as any city would have. Inside that high-walled enclave, you have this kind of island of quietness. It's really quite amazing. It actually is quite Afghan, that while outside it is dusty and harsh, inside there is a whole nother world. It's a world of gardens, right? And the Afghans love to plant particularly pink rose bushes. And so you have this experience of stepping out of this harried and dusty, violent world out beyond the gates, and you step inside, and it's a completely different world. There's this world of quiet sort of reflection, and if you're very sensitive, the walls are even holding the fragrance of those roses. Visiting there was really a deeply moving experience for me. A wonderful sort of last hint about what Dan was all about, where he made his life and the things he aspired to.
He was such a man of love and care, and not only for his family, but everyone he met.
One thing that Anneli says is to be interested in people, and I think that Dan does this on an everyday basis.
The stories how he treated Afghanistan, it brought me with a different point of view. Like, I kind of want to go there and see this place, that they're people, and they should be treated as people and not as like a criminal. Dan Terry's kind of helped me see that.
I've struggled with making judgments about people because it's just so easy and you don't really have to think about it. But when you actually sit down and think about it and you actually open yourself up to the possibilities of who that person actually is, it can just completely change your perspective, and it can make you understand that it's not a thing, it's not a category, it's a person. The way that Dan went out of his way to talk to people, to get to know them, to understand the community that he was in, really spoke to me as a challenge.
This man understood Afghanistan, okay? And he understood Afghanistan in key important ways.
Dan understood we all share the same destiny. We all share a same kind of outcome and result. And it was on this basis that Dan proceeded to work in his life.
He just loved the people. It was just the inner passion for there. Perhaps the adventure and the limitless opportunity to follow what he valued.
He felt that to live was to gain. Every day he was gaining something.
This carpet, which was in the knotting everywhere, would not be built or would not be knotted or created in a single day. That it would be something that you would have to patiently work at, often in the shadows, unrecognized, to create this thing of beauty, this thing of lasting goodness. And Dan walked into that world. He owned its demands. He owned the risks. And the beauty, of course, is that he was utterly enchanted at doing so. This was not a sacrifice. This was not something that Dan did as a duty. He did it as a passion and a joy. And that Afghan carpet, of course, is a beautiful reminder or emblem of what Dan was striving for in his life.